Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to my channel or to this podcast. This podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content. Listener discretion is advised. So for episode 13, I wanted to do something a little bit special because I launched my podcast on Friday the 13th. So I really thought we'd do something a little bit different. So we're going to veer off track of my normal podcast. Now I'm going to be talking about the serial killer that really piqued my interest in true crime and really wanting to understand what serial killers think and why they do what they do. So my episode is going to be a special feature or a little bit more of a bonus. So this week, I'm going to be talking about Edmund Kemper. Now, he was known otherwise as the co-ed butcher or the co-ed killer. I watched or read something about him, I'm going to say in my late teens and early 20s. I'm just not entirely sure about the time frame, but it massively intrigued me. So much so that I started reading more up on serial killers and true crime. And I really loved already watching the true crime channel with my mum, especially Dateline and especially 48 Hours. They were always two of my really big favorites. There's way more, but I've got to say, we'd be here for a little while longer if we went through every true crime TV show that I genuinely loved. But I'd really love for you guys to share in the comments below what your favorite true crime TV shows are. I'm thinking of doing a go live after one of my Friday night launches, and that's going to give you guys an opportunity to ask me any questions. Let me know if that's something that you guys would be interested in. I'd really love to hear from you guys and let me know what you're thinking of the podcast. I want to interact with you guys a little bit more. And it's just kind of fun. Like I like the thought of doing a go live. So there's just so much information on him. And not only that, I'm actually kind of fascinated with the discussions that he had with John Douglas and Robert Ressler. Ed played a huge role in profiling of serial killers. I'm getting way ahead of myself. So like I always do, we're going to start at the beginning. It just makes it a lot easier for us to follow how and when everything sort of happened. So it does seem to be a really common thread that most, and I do say most, I don't mean all, serial killers seem to have a blatant issue with their mum. Edmund Kemper, he's definitely no different in that regard. And some of his childhood, whilst it wasn't abusive and traumatic like we've seen in the past podcasts, it still wasn't what I would call ideal under any circumstances. So Edmund Kemper III was born on December 18th, 1948 to Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell. And this would be in Burbank, California. He was the second child. He would have an older sister and he'd have a younger sister. And by all accounts, this marriage, not really a happy one at all. Ed's father, he would serve time during World War II, and when he returned from the war, he got a job as an electrician, and that's when he would marry Clarnell. It was about in 1952 that the two got married. Now, there's a quote regarding Ed's mum made by his father: "Suicide missions in wartime and the later atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her." I can't imagine if someone spoke like that of me, let alone the mother of his children. Like, not ideal at all, right? So she would constantly make fun of her husband's job. She refused to show her son any love or affection. She feared that this would turn him gay if she gave him some affection. And really, if she'd had the chance to really think about it, she would realize that she was actually contributing to him becoming a serial killer, and a ruthless one nonetheless. They would end up separating in 1957 when he was around 9 years old. He would say that after the separation, his father really wasn't around much. This was already pretty awful, and I think that he began to resent his father as a result. There were many reasons behind the separation, but they included money, his mum wanting a much more strong and domineering man, and she felt like his father wasn't like that at all. And there was a lot of fighting going on. And we're talking some pretty vicious fighting going on. Now, their mum, would actually move herself and the kids to Montana. Now, I should add, because I meant to say this at the start of my podcast, and I'm so sorry. The family actually had a name for Ed, and it would be Guy. So in a lot of interviews and court appearances and all that kind of stuff, you actually hear his sisters call him Guy. Got a little bit confusing in my readings and stuff like that. But once they moved to Montana, his mum would develop a drinking problem on top of that. And during this time, she would also develop a real paranoia and move her son to the basement, fearing that he would rape his sisters. And Ed was a big boy, and he was always the largest in class, but he was always known to be really physically and socially awkward. And given all of the time he spent in his basement, he would actually end up retreating into a world of science fiction and apparently a little bit into the world of occult. His mum just really didn't seem to like him much. She hated the very sight of him. She told him that no one was ever going to love him and that he didn't need to be a sissy or to be weak. So, yeah, his mum definitely had her own concerns, right? In 1961, his father would remarry, this time to a German immigrant by the name of Alfred Weber. Now, she'd had a son from a previous relationship, and for Ed, it would feel like he'd been replaced with Alfred's son. So it was the ultimate rejection in his eyes, and he was already feeling that rejection from his mum, and now on top of that, it was from his father. So for an already what I would call withering psyche, this would be definitely something that I think would push him really over the edge and much further into those dark and violent fantasies he was starting to begin to have. Now, his mum would remarry in 1962 as well. She'd marry a plumber this time. It was around the age of 12 or 13 that he would start delving into the world of animal torture. He would begin his fantasies around killing his mum and just death and destruction in general. His little basement room, it really didn't help him because he wasn't socializing with his family. His stepfather would really attempt to bond with him. However, the marriage wouldn't last for, I think it was no longer than a year. So that really didn't give the time to build that bond. So yeah, it really didn't help. But around the age of 14, after killing the family cat, and the reason behind why he killed the family cat, which is just an absolute, it just blows my mind, this one in particular. The reason he killed it was because the cat was showing more affection to his younger sister. But after this incident, he'd end up running away from mum's and he'd go to be with his dad, who was currently living in California. But he would discover during this time, in particular, that his father had remarried. His new stepmom was not overly fond of him at all. She actually was really, really uncomfortable around him, and she thought he was quite dour, and he sulked around the house a lot. I'm not sure if he would have been sulking as so much more. Look, he's 14 years old, you know, he's not exactly going to be the easiest to be around. He's already the largest boy in class. He's just discovered his dad's been remarried. He's got a step brother that he's never really known about, who's living with his dad, who he idolizes. So I think it was really complicated, and I think his stepmom probably needed to take a moment and understand where he was coming from, if that makes any sense. And again, that's really just my opinion. It's more of trying to get a little bit of insight, but I do think he wasn't given an opportunity for someone to understand him and understand why he was so dour and like he was just a sour human being to be around. But he would stay for a short time with his dad and his new family, but after a couple of instances of apparently scaring his stepmom, the decision was made to send him to his grandparents, his dad's parents. So I don't think his dad would have sent him there, knowing in about 8 months that this would be a truly fatal mistake. He would be sent to his grandparents, so Edmund Kemper Sr. and Maud. Now, they had a farm in North Fork, California. He was not pleased at all to be left with them. Another form of rejection from another parent. He would attend school during his time there at the Sierra Joint Union High School. And the teachers would comment that they found him quiet, he made average grades, and in general, he really just didn't cause a fuss. It was only really his size that drew attention. But he was really different at home with his grandparents. He really hated living there, and it really showed in his general attitude. He was known to be really sullen, and at times the situation was often described as quite tense in that home. His grandma, Maud, now she would remind him of his mum with her domineering behaviour. Now, allegedly, he wasn't allowed to bring friends over to his home. She wouldn't let him participate in school activities. He wasn't allowed to watch cartoons. And to make matters worse, she would actually monitor what TV shows he watched and what books he read. So he already had this very regimented life, and he really was not allowed to go outside that box at all. And Ed would say that she would reply to most of his grievances. If you ever want to live with your father again, you better do as I say. Now, just imagine that threat every time you want to just disagree with someone, or you just want to say, hey, I really want to watch that TV show. You know, you're a teenager. You've got a little bit of rebellion in you. You've got a little bit of that. So I don't know. It's, again, did you really have to do that? Is sort of my mindset. But it was really the opposite experience with his grandfather, Edmund Sr. It's been noted that his grandfather was possibly the only person he ever truly loved. He did seem to show a great admiration for him, but Edmund Sr. did try and curb some of those dark tendencies that he could see coming out a little bit. He'd purchase a .22 rifle and he would teach Ed how to shoot. He would spend his time shooting birds and gophers and other small animals. But the rifle would eventually be taken away from him, as Maud really didn't see the purpose of killing just for the sake of killing. He would see this as a form of punishment, though, and that growing anger was just festering and festering and festering. Now, it would definitely come to a fatal end. So on August 27th, 1964, things would really take a deadly turn. Fed up with all of these feelings he's got going on inside him, he would just finally snap. He even described himself as a walking time bomb during this time. Now, while his grandfather was out and about and running errands, it was just Ed and Maud at home, which, look, let's be honest, that's a recipe for disaster in the first place. They'd be sitting at the kitchen table, they'd be arguing, and this would lead to him storming off, and he was going to go grab his rifle and take his dog, and he was going to go hunting. Now, the last words Maud would ever utter were, "Oh, you better not be shooting birds again." In response to this, he'd shoot her in the head and then a further 2 times in the back. He would drag her body into the bedroom and stab her so hard that the knife would actually bend. Now, Ed would say that the killing of his grandpa was for mercy. He didn't want Edmund Sr. to see what he'd done. He didn't want him to see his wife dead. So once his grandfather had returned from those errands, he'd shoot him straight in the head and place his body in the garage. I think to a degree there is some mercy in that and what he's done. So I do think there was a little bit of selflessness in there. That's my personal opinion. The next part is a little bit confusing, though, for me. Given his really hateful thoughts towards his mum and knowing that he wasn't going to get away with this murder, he'd actually end up calling her. So she would tell him to immediately call the police and wait for them, which he actually did, and then he waited on the porch until they arrived. So the police, they would come and take him into custody. He'd really quickly confess to their murders, like really quickly. Ed would be placed in the California Youth Authority and they would interview him a little bit more. He was only 15 at the time that he did this, and Ed was already showing how cold he could already be. And an example of this in particular would be he shot his grandmother to see what it would feel like. He'd end up being sent for psychiatric testing. He would be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His IQ was at almost genius level. So rather than being sentenced to jail, he was actually, rather than sentenced to a juvenile facility, he'd be sent to the Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane, and he would be there from about December 1964. Now, it wasn't a prison, so it gave Ed a lot more freedom than perhaps he should have had. It has been said that in particular, this facility was for treatment and it wasn't for punishment. Now, I can safely say that Ed would become a better killer and an all-around better criminal after his experience at this hospital. During his time at the facility, he didn't even accept responsibility for killing his grandparents. He was saying that it was beyond his control, but he would work in his psych lab and help administer tests on some of the patients at this hospital, and he took a lot of pride in this work. I cannot tell you, when you watch these documentaries and you hear him talk about his experience at this particular facility, he just absorbed all of that information and all of those tests that he was administering, and he was helping with the psychiatrists. He just absorbed it and just became a better killer as a result of it. And he took glee in it. So it's just, it is 100% unbelievable how much they trusted him during this experience, like during his time at the hospital. Now, we got to know a variety of criminals, specifically in this particular hospital, serial rapists. Now, he'd file that information all the way on how they were caught, what mistakes they made, and their choice in victims. Now, all of these violent fantasies that he was having, they seemed really normal amongst these people, right? So their stories, like their rape and their violent stories, that make a real impression on this little teenager. And I can tell you, it wasn't for the best at all. He would even say that after his second arrest, he would learn from the tests he helped administer, and that made him trick the doctors at the state hospital into thinking he was getting better. He would learn how the test functioned and that would allow him to really easily manipulate the psychiatrists, because he had all this inner knowledge on how they worked and what you were meant to say and how you were going to pass. So against the recommendation though, so once he'd finished, his sentence, we'll call it, the psychiatrists at Atascadero, they would say, do not release him into his mother's care. The board members would say his mum's going to trigger more violence. They would release him into his mum's care in 1969. So she'd relocated to Santa Cruz in California, by the way. You've got a border psychiatrist saying, do not place him anywhere near her. This is going to trigger more violence. He is going to he's going to do more crimes, all this kind of stuff. And for some reason, the parole board thought that this was a good idea. Release him into the care of his mother. His mum at this stage would have a job at the University of California, the Santa Cruz campus. Now, during this time, he was living with his mum. The neighbours would say there were a lot of fights, lots and lots and lots of fights. And he would say that she berated him and the relationship really did deteriorate and was just in general really toxic. The reason I'm going to say is just remember that his mum worked at a university. He would also attend the local community college and he would end up doing really well at this particular community college. But given his IQ, not surprised at all, right? He'd genuinely hoped to get into the police academy, but they had a maximum height that he exceeded. He ended up being 6 feet and 9 inches tall. He would find consolation, though, in going to a local bar called the Jury Room. The officers frequented there, and he'd go and listen to all their stories. He'd become affectionately known as Big Ed, and they liked him well enough, but they did notice he was a little bit odd, but, it was just Big Ed was a lot of the talk. He was severely disappointed not getting into that police force though. But he would get several jobs and he finally settled down working for the state of California in the Division of Highways. It's not really clear what kind of work he did, but it was around this time that his relationship with his mum was probably at its worst, with the direct quote from Ed saying, "My mother and I started right in on horrendous battles, just horrible battles, violent and vicious. I've never been in such a vicious verbal battle with anyone. It would go to fists with a man, but this was my mother. And I couldn't stand the thought of my mother and I doing these things. She insisted on it, and it was just over stupid things. I remember one roof raiser was over whether I should have my teeth cleaned." Now, side note on this, before we get into the killings, during the time of the killings, he apparently had met a girl and he apparently had a fiance. Her name has never been released or anything like that, but apparently he had a fiance and apparently she was in high school. So I'm not sure of that. Her name has never been released, but that's a side note. Once he had saved up enough money, he'd move out and he'd move in with a friend and he'd live in Alameda. He would say that his mum would visit quite often, though, and stop by unexpectedly, which would really drive their relationship further apart because he just felt like he had no space from her and he didn't feel like he was able to get away from her. But he would often get into trouble with money and move back to her house from time to time when he ran into money problems. So sorry, I'm just going to take a quick drink. Now, he would buy a motorbike, but he'd get into two separate accidents. He'd get a settlement out of one of them. He would use that money to buy a Ford Galaxy, which apparently looked like an unmarked police car, but he would make further adjustments to it to just make it look a little bit more like one. He'd install a radio transmitter, and there'd be a large antenna on his car. So he made it seem like, I'm guessing, that when he started wanting to kill, they had that familiarity already that it was a police car, an unmarked police car, so it shouldn't cause any problems. But to test himself before he started killing, he would start to pick up hitchhikers and he'd watch how the girls would react to them and how would be the best way to get these girls to trust him and feel like they would be safe. But during this time in particular, they would be safe because in private, he was indulging in these fantasies and he would imagine what he was going to do to them, but he wasn't acting upon it yet. But he would start to get his car ready for the next set of plans. So you couldn't open the passenger door from the inside. He made that adjustment. The next step he made was he purchased plastic bags, knives, guns, blankets, and he'd store them in the trunk of his car, or the boot if you're from Australia. Now, this is definitely going to lead to him terrorizing women who were really just looking for a ride to their destination, just a hitchhike. So we're going to start now. So between May 1972 and April 1973, Ed would kill 8 people, and this would include his mum as well. Things escalated really quickly over this period, but I do feel like it's been brewing since the time of the murder of his grandparents. So on May 7th in 1972, he would pick up the first of his 8 victims. His mum had managed to get him a sticker of the university for parking, which I think gave the girls a sense of security or familiarity. It was almost like, well, hang on, he attends our school or he attends a university. He's got to be safe. So I think that's why I said, remember where she started to work. But getting back to May 7th, he picked up 2 18-year-old students from Fresno State University, and they had been on their way to hitchhike to Stanford to see friends. Their names would be Marianne and Anita. I'm going to advise everyone now that the next part of the podcast does contain some really graphic content, so please be aware that listener discretion is advised. Ed had decided that he wanted to rape the girls, but what he'd learned from the state hospital was that you don't leave behind any witnesses. So Mary Ann Pesky and Anita Lucheska, I think, would regret getting into this car, and they'd end up paying for it really with their lives. So he would tell both of the girls that he wanted to rape them. He'd drive off the freeway and he'd come to a stop on a dirt road. He would handcuff Marianne to the back seat and then he'd force Anita into the boot of his car. He would put Marianne face down on the back seat and put a plastic bag over her head and would attempt to strangle her. She fought really hard to live. She bit through that bag and the cloth that Ed was using to strangle her would end up breaking. Now, he would stab her repeatedly and then eventually slit her throat, which would in turn, unfortunately, kill her. He would then turn his attention to Anita. Now, she would have a very similar fate. She would also be stabbed, but this time he would be using a different knife. He spoke of Anita during his confession tapes and saying that she was the more gullible one and that's why he would place her in the boot of the car. But she really did put up a fight as well. And during that frenzy of that murder, he would be injured and he would even require stitches. This is not unheard of during stabbings because there's just a frenzy to it and again, it's because I've been watching so many true crime TV shows. In the frenzy of it, it's very slippery. So a lot of the times killers will end up cutting themselves about there just because the knife just slides straight down. Very, very common. Sorry, that was a side note. Once both of the girls were dead, he wanted to take them back to his apartment. A missed opportunity by the police has been noted. Ed would be pulled over for his broken tail light, but nothing ended up happening as a result. But he would say during his confession that if that police officer had made him open up his boot, he would have killed him on the spot. But given that most of the officers already knew about Big Ed, they never really viewed him as a threat. So he was really quickly put on his way. Which, look, let's be fair. It's not like that there's going to be two bodies in the back seat of someone's car, in the boot of someone's car. So I'm not saying any criticism towards the police because it's not like a common occurrence that there's going to be bodies in the boot of a car. I'm just saying it's been noted that it was like a missed opportunity. But once he arrived home, his flatmate, I'm thanking that roommate's lucky stars that he wasn't home because he would bring the bodies inside where he would photograph them and dismember them as well. I'm not sure if you can see the bottom of my door, but my two little kittens are actually currently trying to get into this room. Sorry, getting back. So he would bring the bodies back inside, he'd photograph them, he'd dismember them, but he was just a really vile human being because he would also perform sexual acts on the body parts. He would dump their bodies, but he'd make sure where he placed them so that he could return to them later. Marianne's skull, she would be found in August at the Loma Prieta Mountain, but that's all that would be found of her, and I don't believe the remains of Anita would be found. Ed's next victim would be on September 14th, 1972. He would pick up a 15-year-old at this time. Her name would be Aiko, and she decided to hitchhike as she'd missed the bus on her way to her dance class. He would pull a gun on her, but he would convince her that he wanted to harm himself, and he just wanted someone to talk to about why he wanted to kill himself. Now, he would drive them to a remote location, but he'd also manage in this time to convince her to be tied up and gagged. Things could have turned out so differently for Aiko. He'd get out of the car just to get himself into the back seat because that's where she was, but he'd forget the keys. So he would actually be locked out of the car. She was so trusting and thought that he really didn't want to. I'm guessing she wanted to cooperate. I'm guessing that she knew something was amiss, but she wanted to cooperate to make sure that it wouldn't be any worse. So she'd unlock the door and let him back in the car. Now, he would initially start strangling her, but she would actually be alive, but she'd be unconscious. So he'd take her out of the car where he would rape her. She was killed by her own neck scarf in the end, but he put her in the trunk of his car. Then he'd stop at a local bar for some drinks, and every now and then he'd pop out to the car, open up the boot, just to see her dead body. He would head home and he would dismember her and perform similar acts on her that he'd done to the first two victims. Now, he would dispose of her remains in different locations, but very little of her was found even after Ed's arrest. Perhaps one of the more disturbing things after this murder was that he would attend a psychiatrist appointment as part of his parole. Now, he would fool them as well, and I think that was part of the game for him. The more he got away with it, the saying that he was better, and there was this other side of him that was going out, and killing. Now it's up to 3 women. I think there are parts of him that got off on him keeping these appointments, and I'm guessing it was a little bit of an FU to the police and a little bit of an FU to the psychiatrist. Like, I'm smarter than you. I can get away with this. I've learned so much from my time. So I'm thinking that it was a little bit more of a game for him. He would purchase a .22 caliber pistol, and his new victim would be Cynthia Cindy Schall on January 7th in 1973. By this time, he was actually back at his mum's house, and I have no doubt that his emotions were massively heightened and possibly being emasculated. So he's already pretty heightened in his emotions. Now, Cindy would accept a ride from him. He would force her into the boot of his car, and he would shoot her with his new .22 caliber pistol. This time, he had to take the body back to his mum's house, though. He would put her in the closet, and the next morning, he would dismember her and perform sexual acts on her dead body parts. But before burying her head, he would actually remove the bullet from her skull so that it couldn't be traced back to him. And he would add further insult to injury and bury the head in his mother's backyard and point it at his mother's room. The only way that I can think of this is a bit of an FU to his mum. He would also place the rest of the body parts in plastic bags and throw them off a cliff. These would be found about 24 hours after the murder. He was escalating fast, though, because a month after the murder of Cindy on February 5th, he would murder 2 women again, Rosalind Thorpe and Alison Liu. This time, he'd left the house really riled up and really angry. He just had a huge fight with his mum, and he'd left the house. He would pick up Rosalind first and be driving her in the car. He would then pick up Alice. Now, Alice felt reassured by the fact that another woman was in the car. Now, either he was getting more brazen or confident, or perhaps he was just so mad that he couldn't think straight. But he didn't take the girls to a remote location this time. He'd remark on the view to distract Rosalind. Now, while she was looking out in that general direction, he would shoot her in the head. Now, Alice would be extremely frightened, and it'd be harder to shoot because she was just moving around. She was just doing anything to get out of the way of that, gun. He'd end up shooting her quite a few times. he would take these bodies as well back to his mum's, and he would do the same thing that he'd done to all his other victims. Some of the remains would be found about a week later, and more body parts would be found in March 1973. After killing 6 strangers, though, things would all come to a head in April 1973. All that rage that had been building, it's all going to explode now. I read something really, really interesting, though. Some experts would say that the killing of those girls was just a rehearsal for killing his mum. And once he killed her, he'd be done with murdering. Ed would say something a little different, though, as to why he killed his mum. He feared that the police were actually catching up on him, and that he was worried his mum was going to find his little trophies of his victims and the body parts that he'd buried around the house. So I guess we're never really going to know why he killed his mum at this time, like what brought it all to a head. But I do think it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I think that he probably was rehearsing to kill his mum, but I do still think he was a killer. So, and he enjoyed it. He enjoyed the process. But I do think it was a little bit of paranoia for him of, hang on, the police catching up to me. I've got to get them off my tail. So if I kill my mum, they're not going to think that I would do that to my mum. So on April 20th, 1973, he would wait till his mum had fallen asleep. He would go into her room and he would bludgeon her with a claw hammer, and then he'd slit her throat. Ed would decapitate his mum. He would then put her head on the mantel, and he yelled and screamed at her all the things that he had been holding inside all these years, and then he would throw darts at her head as well. I'm guessing he used that opportunity that her head was on the mantel to say all of those things that he hadn't been able to say, that all of that hate, all of that anger, it's just spewing out. And apparently he did it for hours. Like, we're not talking 1 hour. We're talking like 3 or 4 hours, he was saying, during his confession. He would also remove her larynx, and he would put that down the garbage disposal, but the machine would spit it back out. He would find this darkly amusing. So he would hide her body in the closet. I'm not sure why he'd hide the body, but okay. Okay. And he'd end up going for some drinks. So there are some theories going around about why he killed his last victim, Sarah Sally Hallett. One of them rings the most true for me, and this one is that having 2 victims would deflect any attention away from Ed. Sally would end up being a friend of his mum's, and he would invite her around for dinner. And once she arrived, he would end up strangling her. Now, Ed would stay the night in this house with the 2 bodies, but he would also behead Sally. Now, there's different stories around this night, whether he had sex with the dead bodies and all that kind of stuff, and that's what he did to his mum. He sort of changes his stories every now and then, so it's really, really hard to sometimes gauge what is true and what's not. So given what he'd done with his previous victims, it probably doesn't surprise me too much if he did do that. So I've got to be honest, I'm not sort of gonna lie. I think there was definitely a possibility. But on that on the following Sunday, so I think it was the next day, he would leave town and he'd be driving in Sally's car, but he feared discovery. So he would end up renting another car, and he'd drop off that car at a gas station and telling the gas attendant that apparently this car needed repairs. He would drive for 18 hours and he'd only stop for gas and soft drink or soda and no dose. He was stopped in Colorado for speeding, but because of his quiet appearance, they didn't do anything. So he paid his fine and it was moved on. He was really exhausted by the time he got to Pueblo, Colorado, and it was at this time that he would place a call to the Santa Cruz Police Department, where he already knew quite a few of those officers because he did attend the jury room and they knew him as Big Ed. And this is where his marathon confession would begin. But the initial contact, it would require quite a few phone calls. First, he had to really convince the Santa Cruz police that he wasn't some crank caller. And then he had to help them find him. So he was a little bit disorientated because, he's on no-dose and he's been driving for 18 hours. So he wasn't quite sure how to lead the police to where he was at that phone booth. But when he was taken into custody, a party of investigators from Santa Cruz, they'd end up heading to Pueblo and they'd question him for his crimes, which he claimed responsibility. But as that tape recorder just rolled on and on, he just talked and he talked. He gave some really explicit and very detailed confessions of these 8 murders in particular. He would confess his crimes in particular, to a at the Santa Cruz jail, to an investigator by the name of Michael Alufi. I think that's how you say it. But when he was questioned in an interview as to why he decapitated his victims, he would explain the head trip fantasies were like a trophy. The head is where everything is at. The brain, the mouth, the eyes. That's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. But that's not quite true. There's a lot left in a girl's body without her head. He would later explain that the reason behind his crimes, he would say, my frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually, I wasn't impotent. I was scared to death of failing in a male and female relationship. Guys, this doesn't at all surprise me. His mother from an early age had said to him he was never going to be loved. He's already, during those formative years where we're trying, that psyche and that frontal lobe is coming together, we're trying to build and form those relationships. If you're already being told you're not going to be good enough, you've got that already in the back of your mind. So, and especially from someone who's meant to be your nurturer, your biggest advocate. I mean, my mum, for example, she is one of the biggest advocates for my life. She is just the most amazing person, and nurturing is not even the right word. She supports every decision I make. Not always good ones, not always bad ones, and sometimes bad ones. But she is my biggest advocate in my life, along with my partner, of course. But my mum is my advocate. She is my person that tells me when I'm great and when I'm fantastic. So I can't even imagine if she'd said those things to me when I was younger, it would break me. So I kind of get where he's coming from, that he was scared to death of those relationships. Sorry, got sidetracked. But in case my mum's watching, hi mum, I love you. In May 1973, he was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. A chief public defender by the name of Jim Jackson, he was really limited in his defense, given Ed had a very, very detailed confession and telling the police where body parts could be found. So the only option left for him was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. While awaiting trial, he actually did attempt suicide twice. He did fail both times. Now, the California prosecutors, they would rely on the McNaughton standard for sanity in this case. It's used apparently through most of the USA, but according to the wording, this standard held that a defendant might be found insane if by reason of a disease or defect he did not know what he was doing. He clearly knew what he was doing was wrong, and he had shown very clear pathways of premeditation and planning. Now, the reason that I say he actually planned this was he had all of those, he had the blankets, he had the plastic bags, he had all of that stuff in the boot of his car. So you can't tell me that you're insane when you've got a plan to murder people. Now, granted, I don't think he was completely sane, but I don't think insane. So the trial would start. He would eventually end up taking the stand at some point, and the jury would hear large portions of his detailed confession. So they sort of already had an understanding of what he had to say for himself, but he would discuss while he was on the stand what he knew of his mental state, and he would try to convince the jury that his need to possess a woman and his acts of necrophilia were clear indications of an unstable state of mind. But he'd already told his interrogators that he'd felt remorse and that he'd taken to more drinking to relieve that pressure and all that burden of what he was feeling. And he also described the sexual thrill that he achieved from removing someone's head, and that killing was like a narcotic to him. He also described the feeling that he had that those two beings inhabited his body, and when his killer personality would take over, it was kind of like him blacking out. He had indicated that the same thing sort of happened when he shot his grandmother. Again, this is not the first time we're sort of hearing that serial killers will say that another person took over, or another personality took over. I think it's definitely an indication that there's something not completely right with these guys, but I don't know if they're insane. The trial would last less than 3 weeks, and on November 8th, the 6 men and a 6-woman jury would deliberate for about 5 hours, but they would find Ed sane and guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder. Now, although he really, really wanted to receive the death penalty, at the time in California, they'd placed a hold on all capital punishment, and all death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. So the death penalty only became applicable to crimes that were committed after January 1, 1974. Now, Ed told the judge he genuinely believed that he should be tortured to death. No such luck. Instead, he was actually sentenced to life imprisonment. He was first sent to the California Medical Facility State Prison, and then he was sent to the maximum security prison up in Folsom. But during his early years, when he first sort of started going behind bars, he willingly participated in several interviews with reporters, law enforcement officials, and before long, he was meeting with the FBI to discuss all of those disgusting and heinous crimes and why he committed them. Of course, it was an objective conversation. So FBI special agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, they'd become a part of the behavioural science unit at Quantico in the early years of the 1970s. So while they're on the road talking with local jurisdictions, they come up with the idea to visit prisons and to interview notorious prisoners. And what they'd hoped to do was include this information in a database and basically offer a profile to the police department on what those crimes represented. And that database would be about the traits and the behaviours of known killers that could offer a teaching of sorts on profiles. So Douglas and Ressler, they would both write about their visits to go and see Ed Kemper. But yeah, they were generally in a team when they go and visit these particular killers. They would contact heaps of different types of offenders. They would contact mass murderers, they'd contact assassins, serial killers, and they would collect data from about, it was over 100 victims from what I understood. And that would include also survivors of attempted murderers. And the goal was to gather that information and know how the murder was planned, committed, what the killers did and thought about afterwards, and what were the fantasies that they had and what they did before the next type of killing or incident. Edmund Kemper, he was just one of those 36 men that agreed to be interviewed. Now, if you ever get a chance, I've mentioned it a couple of times, guys. There's a TV show on Netflix. It's called Mindhunter. It really depicts a very good understanding of where, like, the interviews with Ed Kemper, even the actor that they picked, he is tall and he looks like Ed Kemper. And a lot of it is scripted, and I do understand that. But it's absolutely insane, because what it really does is it shows how frightening he could truly be. And Douglas and Ressler said at times they were frightened while interviewing him, just because he could make some pretty offhanded comments. But yeah, truly fascinating. But in the most of the recent years, Mr. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, he's garnered a reputation for being quite the model prisoner. He's once again in charge of scheduling other inmates' appointments with psychiatrists, and he has spent over 5,000 hours narrating audiobooks such as Dune and Star Wars. It truly fascinates me. I can't say it enough. He boggles my mind. He's so smart. Yeah, what I wouldn't do to be John Douglas or Robert Ressler and get to interview him, it would have been pretty fascinating. But guys, thank you so much for listening to episode 13. If you like this podcast, please hit that like button, subscribe, and go and listen to the other episodes if this is your first time. I hope you all have a fabulous weekend, my peanuts, but I will be back soon. All right, see you guys.